Okay, so maybe about a week ago, a well-known YouTuber who does science videos debunked a quantum music video, and the person who did the debunking, he it's his name's Professor Dave. Greetings, and Professor Dave, he does not hold back when he does his debunking. He's not afraid to tell it like it is. And I didn't even watch the video because I know, you know, I mean, I don't need to be debunked about fake music healing videos. But I did post a comment in his comment section. Does he think quantum physics professor Basil J. Hiley is fake? Um, or Eddie Oceans at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, or Field's mental math professor Lon Kahn, because they all focus on noncommutativity. And if you study noncommutative music, that's the secret of quantum biology healing. And, just left that quick comment. I didn't even check for follow up replies because with YouTube, you really sometimes you can check, you'll be able to see replies, but a lot of times, most of the time actually, you don't know if somebody's commented or replied. You have to search it out, and that's why technically YouTube's not considered social media, which is fine by me. And um I mean, you can definitely do social interaction if you search it out, so it's good enough. But anyway, I do still get a lot of interest in my research, and that inspires me to uh, keep reviewing my research. And I did finish the negative math book by Professor Alberto Martinez, and then I was reviewing his book on Einstein, kinematics. That's the secret of relativity, and the the negative math book was part of his PhD research on Einstein's kinematics, and essentially he realized the secret of relativity is non-commutativity, and that the Lorentz invariance relies on this asymmetric um, time, or asymmetric non-commutative mathematics. And um, so when you read his negative math book, he's really pointing out that the what's called symbolic algebra is really about the difference of quality versus quantity in mathematics. And when you have difference in quality, that's a change in the direction as a variable. Um, so you have like negative and positive, but it's not necessarily a change in quantity because it's um, just because something is negative does not mean it's less than zero. It's just a change of direction from zero. And it's a subtle difference, but that's essentially what makes it symbolic and not just quantitative. Because normally, in science they try to tie the mathematics to physical um, reality, and so like Einstein was really focused on what is physically observable, and but um, Martinez points out that Einstein uses this term phronomy, and this is what Basil J. Hiley also emphasized, that in Einstein's final years, he realized that non-commutative algebra from um, uh, the quaternions would be the secret to explain relativity, and that's precisely what Professor Alberto Martinez is focused on is the Hamiltonian quaternions as a non-commutative quantum algebra to explain relativity. And this is the whole point of non-commutative geometry, as it's called, or um, what Einstein called phronomy, which is quantum algebra. And so that's what Basil J. Haley was really studying in his final years, and he gave several talks about this. Um, Problem is that when he was focused on non-commutativity, but when people are scientists, they get trained in the commutative geometry, and so they are basically hardwired in symmetric um, mathematics. And so, even though Basil J. Haley was focused on non-commutativity, the other scientists either ignore it or they think it's just something you can add on to um, to the symmetric mathematics. And so that's what makes Basil J. Haley's work very radical, along with Alon Khan. And the whole point of non-commutativity then was to unify quantum physics with relativity through this asymmetric um, time that's a qualitative change in direction. So the idea is, well, how can you have a change in direction if it's not spatial? And that's why Einstein used this term phronomy because he's really well, Basil Haley said, well, it's used in music, and I studied music. I was accepted into the music composition degree, and so I took pretty advanced music classes at the university, and I never came across that term phronomy in music theory, but I mean it is there if you stumble across it. And somebody even did their music PhD on Basil J. Haley's work, and that's what Basil J. Haley was talking about. He was followed around by this guy in Finland who was doing his music PhD in phronomy. For I don't even know if I'm saying the word correctly. He always struggled to pronounce it correctly too, because it's like got like extra O's and M's and N's. um, so essentially, um, Basil Hiley also emphasized that that's the secret to understanding the weak measurement experiments of Yakir Aranov's research group. And so Basil J. Haley argued that the Yakir Aranov's two-vector model is not correct, and that the non-commutative um, understanding is the proper understanding of the weak measurements, which then also explains anti-gravity, or what they call gravitational repulsion, as I cited um, in my research. And so not only do you have a unification of relativity and quantum physics, but you also have an explanation for anti-gravity, and it also explains black holes. And this is what Nobel physicist Gerard de Hooft is talking about when he calls it the eternal black hole, but also Paul S. Wesson, who basically said that relativity means that we live in a five-dimensional black hole, that the universe is a black hole. and that truth explains spiritual phenomenon um, from Louis de Broglie law of phase harmony. And Louis de Broglie law of phase harmony is the same as the David Bohm's quantum potential, with the significant difference that Louis de Broglie was still trying to work in Euclidean space-time, and so Basil J. Hiley just pointed out that you cannot have any kind of like geometry of waves. You have to have this quantum algebra because if you try to, rely on a 4D geometry of waves, um, it just doesn't work because there's too many variables involved. And so then Basil J. Hiley emphasized that just this completely changes our understanding of quantum biology. If, the non-commutativity means that the quantum coherence can be maintained at the macro scale. And this, of course, was the point of Eddie Ocean's um, for his creation of quantum psychology as mind-body integration based on non-commutativity as the secret of non-Western meditation. So now, all of a sudden, you have non-commutativity explaining the secret of non-Western alchemy, and or what Eddie Ocean's called Neigong, and also in terms of quantum biology, it explains the problem of entropy of modern science destroying ecology. And this was a focus of Basil J. Hiley with David Bohm because they both were saying, well, the ecological crisis is caused by a wrong understanding of physics, a wrong foundation of physics. And we have to essentially change how we understand entropy. And so, in the standard understanding of relativity, they basically say that time is a spatial dynamic, and that time doesn't exist other than a psychological and biological experience of entropy, and that entropy is inherent to being alive because anytime you make any external observation, you have to assume a primitive causation, which means you have a linear operator of time. And what's fascinating about this is that that's what math professor Luigi Borzacchini calls a cognitive prejudice ever since the um, creation of irrational magnitude from Philolaus and Archytas for Platonic philosophy. So you have this very ancient cognitive prejudice in science that's assuming you have to rely on an external observation for measurement, whereas in quantum biology, you can rely on listening as logical inference for um, a non-local negative entropy that's this non-commutative, newly discovered force, as Basil J. Hiley explains. The quantum potential is a new quality of energy. It's a force that violates the conservation of momentum. This is understood that Louis de Broglie's pilot wave violates the conservation of momentum. So normally you have momentum as inverse to wavelength based on velocity. That again's assuming a Euclidean space-time. But in quantum physics, we know that momentum is directly proportional to frequency. So then you have a time and frequency. So momentum is to wavelength as frequency is to time. But when you rely directly on time and frequency, then you can have this negative frequency due to the noncommutativity that Alon Khan explains is the truth of music theory and also the truth of negative entropy as the truth of um, what Roger Penrose calls proto consciousness, which is this non-local information, or what Basil J. Haley calls active information. So it's a non-local formless awareness, as it's called in non-Western philosophy. The formless awareness being the void, the great void, absolute void that eternally radiates light from the future. So this is what my research has focused on: is that how a proper understanding of music theory enables the ability to use meditation for um, healing and storing up energy and having precognitive visions. And Olivier Costa de Beauregard then argues that precognition is the foundation of all other spiritual and paranormal powers. And he wrote a book about this called Time as the absolute or magnitude of time or something like that. I checked it out. I got it through interlibrary loans, so I had to return it. I don't have the book anymore. But so Olivier Costa de Beauregard, he basically had it turned around where he was saying that the asymmetry is because of your reliance on an observation, on an external observation, due to relativity, and that's pretty much what Jack Sarfati argues also. So Jack Sarfati is relying on this same kind of argument that Olivier Costa de Beauregard made, and even Jack Sarfati even says this. He defers to Olivier Costa de Beauregard, but the if you study Jean Brimond, the quantum physics professor, he points out that this action at a distance due to Bell's inequality is actually, before there's any observation. And that's also Basil J. Haley's point, is that this is not an asymmetry um, after any kind of like collapse of the wave function in quantum physics, but it's a process or a force that's going on before space time exists in terms of primitive causation, in terms of having a sense of linear time. So the weak measurements have proven that the future is guiding the past, and from this proto consciousness. And so the proto consciousness itself is instantaneous. So when you have this qualitative change of direction of the future and the past, um, that ability is happening as non-locality. So the non-locality is, you know, some kind of, like, you could call it an ether, global, a new definition of the ether. But the problem again is that it's not observable in terms of external measurement, or um, I mean, it can be logically inferred, and that's why you have religion, because in terms of biology, humans realized at some point that you have this realm of awareness that you can logically infer, and even if you have a precognitive vision, um, you are experiencing the vision in your own past, but you're able to access the future. And so there's always this, like, I mean, the science calls it uncertainty, but it's actually not an uncertainty. It's just a process or dynamic of the future and the past overlapping through this formless awareness, or the emptiness that occurs through a deep listening process or logical inference. So just like you wake up from deep dreamless sleep, you wake up and you say, "Oh, I had a great sleep and I experienced great bliss. I feel much better." But when you were in that deep dreamless sleep, there was a emptiness in reality. And maybe, what if you never woke up? You don't know. You don't know that. Um, and of course, as like science is supposed to ignore that and just say, well, we can study people while they're sleeping and see their deep, slow, brain waves, and um, but that's not the same as, like, the source of the energy that causes that subjective awareness. Um, so, for example, in terms of psychology, there was a study I was read a book on about dreaming, and it was about the Holocaust, and they basically argued that, well, it's actually healthy for, um, victims of the Holocaust to have that memory repressed, to keep it repressed as a deep trauma that they can't remember. And I don't know if that's true, but this was the argument of the book, was that there's always going to be something that's remains unconscious. And there's different states of perception when you're awake, and meditation, we consider it an altered state of consciousness, compared to talking and thinking. But when you compare it to deep dreamless sleep, then um, the non-Western cultures have a term for something that's beyond deep dreamless sleep, and like in Buddhism, they call it prana, which is like translates as wisdom, but essentially it's like a visionary state where all of your perceptions are able to, be instantaneously transduced through this ether that you can experience. And so for the person experiencing it, it is instantaneous, but for people around them, there's a different space time for external versus internal reality. And so that difference in space time, that's something I called, just from my own experience, I called it like, you know, general relativity versus special relativity. Because um, if you study the Taoist Yoga Alchemy book, they explain that you can experience a dizziness, and the dizziness is actually a space-time vortex, and that's what caused me to stop doing my intensive meditation. Well, along with, I mean, there was other things I did not understand, but obviously you're required to maintain purification in terms of your physiology and everything and psychology, and there was a lot of details I didn't understand because it's a lot more complex than I realized, when I first got into it. And my teacher, Chen Yilin, he said, well, for an advanced level, you need to be on retreat or in a monastery or something. You cannot maintain an advanced level um, in normal um, like living situation. And but if you look at our original human culture, um, we relied on long distance hunting where the males would go off alone and they would do this training where they'd go off for a month, 1 month alone, just to build up the energy. So it's pretty fascinating that that kind of purification training was part of our original human culture to maintain this connection to, what they call which is just like spit when I said it, 'cause but it was considered, a female life force energy. And of course, I've written about that in my books, how it's connected to physiology or whatever. And so it gets very esoteric very quickly, but it also explains our ecological crisis today and why the crisis is so bad, but also what will fix it. Because in terms of life on Earth, when we look at algae relies on the same um, secret of quantum negative entropy that's non-local force that is the secret of meditation. And this was studied by somebody I cite it's somebody who was cited by um, Oliver Reiser and Andrea Puharich, whom I've written about, but a fellow named Andrew Cochrane, and he just realized that the biological molecules based on the carbon and nitrogen and oxygen um, are low temperature molecules with low entropy. And so they have a low heat capacity. And when you have that, he called it a momentum molecule. And it's so you get basically a room temperature superconductivity. And that's maintained through the 1/2 spin of the electron valence and not from the nucleus of the atoms, but from the molecule as a whole. So, like with chlorophyll, you have the 1/2 spin of each electron, but it creates a chain where the molecule as a whole has this circular transduction with the photon energy. So you're able to get this non-local energy transfer from the photon energy, the frequency and time. And that's precisely what's happening in um, meditation through the red blood cell that's equivalent in structure to the chlorophyll, with the only difference being iron instead of magnesium. And so in Taoist alchemy, the um, red blood holds what they call the yin qi, and the yin qi is also called the red dragon, but it's the um, in science it would be considered negative ion energy. So that's something I've written about more in detail elsewhere, and um, yeah, so it gets very fascinating when you connect it back into the non-Western meditation training, and yeah, so I feel pretty happy about my research to convert my training in non-Western meditation back into Western science and the connection to explain our ecological crisis and crisis of social injustice, and also, why science is basically the real religion of our time, and that we shouldn't um, be anti-scientific. On the contrary, we need to, really study science to figure out these secrets of science that I feel like I've been successful in doing that, and I was able to correspond with Basil J. Haley several times. I feel honored to have had that experience, and he read my research and he said he loved it, and so he was real nice. And I never told him about my article getting published, which I feel kind of bad about, but um yeah, he passed on like right after my article got published. Um and let's see. Um he was said he was honored to have been featured in this book. Um so this guy, Dean Rickles, he's a professional pianist, musician, and physics professor in Australia. And then Harold Ottensbacher is a Jungian psychologist. And so there's there's definitely some academic research on in this realm. Uh, Lee Smollin's book on Time Reborn. What's it say there? From crisis in physics to the future of the universe. So not, he's not holding back, and he of course was had the same quantum physics professor that I had for his first teacher. As I mean, that was the only teacher I had for quantum physics was Herbert J. Bernstein. Basically, he's a Bohmian quantum physicist who developed quantum teleportation using that same secret of non-commutativity. He just calls it a donut because that's what you have with this 720-degree spin with the Mobius structure, but it's not a structure. It's a dynamic, like a fifth dimensional process. So yeah, I can say I'm part of a school of academia that's so radical. It's not even organized as a school. It's just like a I've been able to correspond with. I've been able to piece together different academics that, like John G. Williamson. I mean, he worked on getting Luke Hoffman joining together with other scientists, and but he didn't call it non-commutativity. But when I contacted him, he said, "Yeah, it is the same thing." So um, the the terminology is like still not solidified, so that's all right. It's not a but so when I wrote this book, which is of course free online, this I go, I cite a lot of this research, but yeah, so it's for me, I try to practice the meditation, but any extra energy that I develop, I use it for just in my interactions around me. And um, so as Trinity Lynn said, my energy will always be weak. As long as I don't store it up like that. So that's that's how it is. That's what I. Here's another one. Ted Baston, and he was the guy who worked with Andrija Puharich in testing Uri Geller, and also David Bohm. I wonder if I'm guessing that Basil J. Haley is in this book also. Let's see if I can find it. So yeah, yep, he's cited in here twice, 149 and 189. Let's see what it says. So let's see what he says here. Hiley introduces this topic with a survey of possible approaches to a discrete phase space. That's what noncommutativity is, a discrete phase space, especially in regard to the quantum theoretical limitation on simultaneous momentum and position measurement. The experimental identification of the elements of a simplical complex. That's what Hiley was working on. Was this simplex geometry is what they called it. Caused a good deal of discussion. As these did not lead to an unambiguous conclusion, some attempts were made to discover analogues in more familiar theory for some of the theoretical constructions of Atkin and Hiley to see if these could be an alternative starting point. Okay, so that's what this came out in 71. This was the year I was born. Okay, let's see. There's another thing to Hiley. Hiley, there we go. Nexus subjects. Okay, 189. Okay, let's see what he says here. 189. Looking for Hiley should be in here. Oh, it's just cited in the reference 4. Let's see what that is. Oh, this chapter is by Basil J. Hiley. I didn't realize he has a whole chapter in this book. It's funny. It's like, okay, a note on discreteness, phase space, and cohomology theory. Oh, I haven't even read this whole book chapter by Hiley. Wait. So, the ideas in this paper stem from a suggestion made to me by Bohm as early as 1963. I want to see if he mentions noncommutativity, because if he does, this would be the earliest where he focuses on it. Let me just speed read it real quickly. Yeah, but he's talking about simultaneity, the whole problem of simultaneity, and the EPR paradox, which is the Bell's inequality. Okay, yeah. So he's talking about Planck's constant cubed, or h bar cubed, because that's Basil J. Haley's big point is that like Richard Feynman and Dirac, they are ignoring Planck's constant squared, in their mathematics. And when you have Planck's constant squared, that's where you get the quantum potential. So, what else? So you start talking about Heisenberg. And yeah, then he starts getting into the simplex geometry. And okay, so yeah, I'll have to read this in detail. It's kind of fun. Get a new highly paper to read. It's weird that I haven't read it before. Okay, so I'll sign off. Go back to sleep. Um. Anyway, this is my response to Professor Dave dismissing quantum music healing as being New Age bunkum.